I mean, the topic today is, as you know, Lebanon 2005, first spark of the Arab Spring. I did put a question mark there, and I think I even responded to that question mark in the little blurb I was asked to provide by saying, well, no, it probably wasn't the first spark of the Arab Spring, and yet it was in many of the things that we saw in Lebanon in 2005 are essential ingredients in what we are seeing today in other Arab countries. And this, in a sense, I think is quite important, because as we look today, as we seek to impose some kind of interpretation on what's happening in the Arab world today, we tend to see 2011 as sort of a unique moment. Before we had the Dark Ages, no one knows what we'll have afterwards. I think it's worth correcting that image just a little bit. I'm speaking about Lebanon, but two things happened in 2005 I think we should mention. There were the Iraqi elections in January. I think they merit also a role in this story. But I'm not Iraqi, so I'm going to tell you about the second thing that happened. It's Lebanon. And I think we should bear in mind what happened there and see, in a way, how does it reflect what we're seeing today. I think I was right to be surprised when the myriad Arab revolts began earlier this year. And I noticed that absolutely no one, almost nobody, in terms of the Arab intelligentsia, Arab media, almost no one seemed to mention Lebanon 2005 or Iraq 2005. Let's stick to Lebanon. No one mentioned it, or very few. Now, the reason for my surprise was that, as I said, everything that took place in Lebanon, or many of the salient aspects that took place in Lebanon, are being repeated today. Now, for those of you who maybe need your memory refreshed, what happened in Lebanon in 2005, very briefly? Rafiq Hariri, not Saad.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Saad will forgive you. Rafiq Hariri, Saad's father, was assassinated on the 14th of February, 2005. For about a month after that, you had a number, tens of thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands of people at some stages going down to Martyrs Square in Beirut and demanding a withdrawal of Syrian forces from Lebanon, because Syria was seen, to my mind rightly, as a key actor in the assassination of Hariri, demanding the resignation of the Lebanese government, at the time the Karami government, and demanding the resignation of security chiefs in particular, the head of the internal security forces, the head of what's known as the Sûreté Générale, the Minister of Justice, and the head of the ISF. And in April of 2005, the Syrians, I'm really cutting to the chase here, the Syrians did pull their forces out of Lebanon after, I believe, a 29-year presence in the country. This entire episode was called, I think, mistakenly, the Cedar Revolution. At the time, if you recall, this was named by Paul Dobriansky. At the time, the Americans were very much taken up by revolutions, much more than they seem to be today. And in fact, Lebanon had earned this label, although what happened in 2005 was in no way a revolution. It was simply a fine emancipatory moment, a fine moment of emancipation. Now, those who went down to Martyrs Square represented a substantial cross-section of society, with, I think, an important exception. The majority in the Shia community did not go down there. They supported Hezbollah, they still do. And yet, very clearly in 2005, the majority that did go down to Martyrs Square was, it was a majority of the Lebanese population. And I believe that these demands that they had put forward were very much demands that, reflected a majority view of the mood at the time. Now, I'd like to investigate, I'm not going to spend my time going back to 2005, I'd like to investigate that moment in the context of what we're seeing today in the Arab world. And with your permission, I will limit this to four important, as I said, four salient issues that happened then and that we see reflected today. What are these four salient issues that I will focus on? The first is the use of public space. Martyrs Square in Lebanon, many other squares that we've seen in the last year. The second issue I would like to focus on is the demand for overhauling of the security structure, for the instruments of repression. This we saw in Lebanon in 2005, we've seen it this year again in virtually all the Arab countries. A third thing to investigate is the role of foreign intervention. And the last thing is the aftermath, and how the aftermath of Lebanon 2005 and of what we're seeing today in many other Arab countries, how it may lead to a reinterpretation of these singular events. Let me begin with the use of space. As we survey what happened in Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, we noticed that something that was very clear in Lebanon in 2005. And it's something that the Lebanese grasped, I think, early on. They grasped the need, when engaging in protest, to define yourself, to secure for yourself a public space where rallies can be held, toward which protesters can converge, which is under the eye of media, and that retains symbolic as much as geographic relevance. That said, the protesters in many Arab societies today have almost endowed on those places where they need a symbolism of its own. It's very important, I think, to retain the power, the symbolic power of a place. And I think this is what happened in Lebanon in 2005. It's what we see in Tahrir Square. Now, what happened in Martyrs Square, just if I could just, again, take you back briefly. Martyrs Square, I don't know how many of you have been to Beirut, but it's located really in the downtown area, the rebuilt downtown area of Beirut. It's on the old Green Line between the predominantly Muslim western part of the capital and the predominantly Christian eastern part of the capital. Therefore, it's almost naturally, it could be transformed into a place of reconciliation. It was also the place, and this was maybe a coincidence, but it was a very happy coincidence. It was the place where the Hariri family decided to bury Rafi Hariri when he was assassinated. And this sort of bestowed on the place a symbolic value, but it did something else, I think, in practical terms that was very interesting. It's that it almost prevented the security forces from clearing Martyrs Square easily, because people would go down to the square to visit Hariri's tomb, and then they would gravitate towards Martyrs Square, which is only a few dozen meters away. And the security forces could not very well prevent people from going and visiting the tomb of the recently assassinated Rafi Hariri. So that these two spaces, Hariri's tomb and Martyrs Square, in a sense, fed off each other and gave each other, they in a way kept each other alive. Also, two other factors. Martyrs Square is next to the old city that Hariri was responsible for rebuilding. It was a controversial reconstruction project, but he was essential in bringing it to fruition. So that added to the symbolism. And it was also near a number of media outlets, including the Al-Nahar newspaper, so that it was a place easy to watch, a place easy to keep under the eye of the camera. Now, in many respects, we see a replication of this throughout the Arab world. We've seen it this year. In Egypt, of course, you have Tahrir Square, and the ambition of the Mubarak regime was to, if you recall, retake Tahrir Square early on. And when it was unable to do that, it tried to create chaos in Tahrir Square, tried to create a security situation that was unbearable, the idea being to frighten people so that they would leave Tahrir Square, if you remember the famous incident with the camels, but also the fighting between the pro-Mubarak supporters and the and those of Tahrir Square. In other words, if you can't capture a space, at least you try to make it untenable for the other side. In Bahrain, perhaps a very interesting situation, the protesters took over a Pearl roundabout, if you remember. The regime relatively quickly entered and did something to this day that I find quite remarkable, is they destroyed the monument at the center of this roundabout. In other words, they completely was sort of, you know, they obliterated the symbolism of the place. And I mean, how symbolic is a roundabout? It's not the best place to defend, but it is a place where tents were put up. It is a place that was given, that has gained the symbolism from that event. In Yemen, of course, we had rival squares taking place, the pro-Ali Abdullah Saleh supporters and those opposed. And in Libya, it was not so much a place or a plaza or a locale as much as a city that was taken over by the rebels, Benghazi. And that, of course, offered a number of new opportunities in the sense that when you have a city, obviously you have a territory in which you can create a government or a rival government to the government you're trying to overthrow. In Syria, we've had the Assad regime. It's a very interesting case in Syria because the regime has had to face this initially these proliferating revolts from the south in Daraa to the area of Homs, Hama. Now the regime did try to contain and has succeeded largely in containing in places like central Damascus and in Aleppo, but it has lost track, it has lost ground substantially in places like Hama, in of course Homs, of large parts of the city, a different strategy in the Kurdish areas. But once again, what we're talking about is fight over space, because space contains, to a certain extent, the ability to project political power, independence. It's a place from which the regime, you know, it's very powerful to see a place where you can have tens and hundreds of thousands of people and the regime is unable to remove them. It really underlines or affirms the weakness of a regime. And the way to protect your space, as I said in many of these, in Lebanon 2005, in many of these Arab societies, by building a tent city and in effect settling in a place and not leaving it at any point. And who tends to live in these tent cities by and large? It's not people of my age or older, or it tends to be young people who tend to be idealistic. So that those who are in these spaces tend to be, I won't use the word radical, but more convinced of their positions than the older peers. And often, it's the tent cities where the frustration is highest, as we saw last week in Tahrir Square. It's really in the tent cities where the people are the most mobilized, and it's there also where the fall tends to be most bitter, when reality kicks in. Second thing I would like to look at, with your permission, is the instruments of repression. In 2005, as I said earlier, Lebanon was essentially embodying a rebellion against the security forces and a rejection of the security chiefs. For the first time that I can remember in the Middle East, or in the Arab world at least, four senior Lebanese security chiefs, or judicial officials, one was the justice minister, were forced to resign in 2005, or were fired by the government, were simply removed. Now this is, we should, I think, reflect on this a little bit for those of you who know the Middle East. It's not often that the security chief is, in fact, it's, if someone can think of another example, I would be happy to hear it. It's not often where the security chief leaves his office where he's not dismissed by a monarch or a dictator. It's not, you know, the street does not remove security officials in the Middle East, except if there is war. I mean, we can talk about Libya in a bit of a different context. One of those, if I could just make a brief aside. One of those who left was a gentleman by the name of Jamil Sayed, who was the head of the Sûreté Générale. And in a way, maybe it was, I tell this story only as a reminder of the arm of the security apparatus. When Jamil Sayed was forced to leave, or I think he resigned, I'm not sure if he was fired or dismissed, I think he resigned, at the end of April 2005. I called my friend, the journalist Samir Asil, to congratulate him, because Samir had attacked Jamil Sayed and had been quite, I would say, persecuted by Jamil Sayed. He had been followed and harassed, and Jamil Sayed had never forgiven Samir Asil. I called him up and I said, I just wanted to congratulate you on this day. And he was very happy. He said, yes, it really is a good day. Well, just over a month later, he was assassinated in Beirut. And I'm convinced that his past had something to do with it, his past enmities. And so, I mean, yes, you could get rid of the security chief, but the apparatus does tend to stay. It does tend to stay longer. And it does, it can come back and haunt you. In Lebanon, in 2005, those protesting against Syria and against the Lebanese government, I think quite cleverly, here tactics played on the differences between the different types of security agencies. I still remember on the first Monday after Hariri's assassination, I was marching with my fellow protesters, and we were going down to the old city, and we were followed by units of riot police behind us. And as we were walking down the road towards another square, not Market Square, but nearby, there were 2 rows of soldiers on either side. And people began, instead of telling the army to go to hell, they said, no army in Lebanon but the Lebanese. And I thought this was quite a clever, people had done this before. You neutralize the security forces. You play on the nationalism in the Lebanese army. And indeed, subsequently, the Lebanese army avoided a confrontation with those protesters throughout the post-February 14th period. The Lebanese army played a very subtle game where it would implement the decisions of the government and at the same time avoid implementing it. So that, for example, on February 28th, I remember this is a very amusing recollection, the army said people are not allowed to enter Martyrs Square to protest. Of course, there were tens of thousands of people there. The army had made a barrier in front of us. And as we were about to move forward, someone said, wait, hold on. I need a group of 10 or 15. Come with me. So we went with him. And we entered into this military barrier, these soldiers. And one of the soldiers muttered to a woman next to me, push, push. And she couldn't understand. He said, push, so I can let you through. And so she pushed and she got through. And it was very interesting because the army was playing it both ways, you see. It was implementing its orders, but it wasn't firing on the crowd. And we see this again in Egypt. Earlier this year at Tahrir Square, the Egyptian army at the time also tried to play subtly this game. And the protesters tried to play this subtle game with the army. Let's use the army against the regime. The army itself, almost propping itself up as a legitimate force on whom the protesters could rely, even as it was out to protect its own interests. So, I think, just before I go on to the third thing, I think there is a fundamentally important moment when when protesters come to the conclusion that their security chiefs are accountable. I think that the value of what we're seeing in the Arab world today, the merits of what we are seeing today, will be to a large extent defined by the security orders that are imposed in the aftermath of these revolts. In other words, are these new security orders, are the instruments of repression under civilian control? Are they accountable? Do they accept the pluralism in many of these societies? Yes or no? And this, I think, is a fundamental question that we have to ask of all the Arab group. In Egypt, what did we have? We had perhaps regime decapitation. I think it was almost inevitable that we would reach the stage that we reached last week, where the public said, well, wait a minute, what, are you making fun of us? We got rid of Mubarak, but it's not Mubarak. We wanted to change the system, at least some of the protesters. Then things became complicated when elections came. This is this is an essential movement, I think, in an Arab society. In Libya, it's the contrary thing. What is defining the post-war security system, or the instruments of repression? It's really the balance of power at the end of the war. The war stopped suddenly, rather, once Gaddafi was found and killed. Today, you have a number of militias that reflect tribal, regional, other loyalties. They're trying to form an army, but I think that's going to have mixed success. In effect, the balance of power, the military balance of power, is being defined by what happened, the status quo at the end of the war. Will this lead to a more accountable security force in Libya? I hope so, but I don't think it will. The same thing in Syria. So this, I think, is a fundamentally important moment in 2005 when the Lebanese were able to say our security chiefs in some way were responsible for Hariri's assassination. They represent an illegitimate political order that we're trying to get rid of with the Syrian departure. And I think that's also worthy of mention. The third thing I would like to discuss is outside intervention. Two reasons I think Lebanon didn't get its due from 2005 were because of the last two dimensions I'll discuss. One is foreign intervention, the second is the aftermath of what happened in 2005. In 2005, I think the problem Lebanon had is that in opposing Syria, it really went against the general trend in the region that held, well, let me reverse. Who supported what went on in Lebanon in 2005 internationally? Well, Jacques Chirac, France, and George W. Bush, although Bush did it a bit late. I think Bush caught on late to what was happening in Lebanon, but when he caught on, he stuck with it. So that I think the perception in the Arab world is that we're not going to be with Bush against two bulwarks of resistance, namely Hezbollah and Syria. This affected a lot, I think, the perception in the Arab world of what happened in Lebanon. This was perceived as, to this day, you will have people tell you this was a bourgeois revolt. In fact, it was much more than that. But who was on TV? It was westernized Lebanese who tended to dress nicely, who tended to speak different languages. The middle class, just to give you the dynamics of that month. Remember, Hariri was killed on a Monday, so that every Monday they would commemorate his assassination. Now, who works on Mondays? Who can take a day off on Monday? Let me say. Not many people, okay? If you're a professional, maybe you can. But if you're an employee, if you're relatively modest means, you can't go to your boss and say, I'm taking today off. He'll tell you no. So that those who kept alive the protest were those who could go in the week, during the week time, who tended to be from the middle class, educated, who tended to live around Martyrs Square. And because of that, it became a perception that this was somehow a middle class, as someone, I can't remember who, very uncharitably described the so-called Cedar Revolution, described it as a Prada Revolution, which I found, if we can do a Prada Revolution, it's to our honor. But there were also many people behind that who maybe were not there because they couldn't afford to be there, but who at distinct points during that month came down to Martyrs Square. I mean, of course, March 14, 2005. Were you? I think, perhaps were there 1 million people there? I don't know. Maybe there were 800,000, maybe there were 7. There were an awful lot of people, and from all social categories. But the point I'm making is that there was a perception that, you know, these middle-class Lebanese, who have the backing of George W. Bush and Jacques Chirac, are not really people who were going to side with, who were really comfortable with, against Hezbollah and Syria. And even, I would say, in the Western left, there was, I remember very well, on the 8th of March, Hezbollah organized a massive demonstration. And suddenly, you could just almost hear the rumble of contempt amongst many in the international left. That, you know, now, finally, we're seeing the authentic Lebanese. It's not these you know, it's not these Prada people who represent them, it's Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is with Syria, and so Lebanon is divided on the issue of Syria. It was, certainly it was, but I still think there was a substantial number of people who were unhappy with the Syrian presence. And the Syrians did indeed leave, and they had the real support of half the population, as many said they would not go there. I think there is another element that we're seeing in the Arab world today that reflects this. Of course, in the Arab world today, the whole issue of foreign intervention, as you know, has taken on a great deal of importance in light of Libya, in light today of Syria, in light of what, even of Egypt. And in a way, it's redefined the role of foreign intervention, I think, in the Arab world. In the past, there was a perception that any kind of Western intervention in the Arab world was, by definition, illegitimate. In Libya, we saw that this was not the case. In Syria, you've had protesters asking, demanding for outside intervention. There have been divisions or differences within the Syrian opposition on this question, but the issue of foreign intervention is not illegitimate in the way that it seemed to be in 2005. You see, or it seemed to be in 2003 in Iraq. You know, in the Arab world, there is a much greater acceptance of the notion that foreign intervention against the dictatorship is somehow acceptable, or more acceptable than it used to be. Now, essential to this, if I could just throw this in, is the element, the question of narrative. I think we should not underestimate the heroic narrative aspect of these revolutions. When people see others revolting, the Egyptians looked at Tunisia, the Libyans looked at Egypt, the Syrians looked at Libya, the Syrians looked at Egypt. They suddenly see this sort of meta-narrative taking form in their minds of successful revolution, successful revolt. And they then want to be part of it. I think this was essential to the spreading of what took place in the Middle East. And in a way, that meta-narrative does have room, does leave room in itself for a certain amount of acceptable foreign intervention, okay? In a way, if the narrative is seen as we're running the game, if we're revolting, then it becomes almost fréquentable, it becomes almost acceptable to absorb the notion that those helping you from outside are really feeding into your narrative. And we remember this very well. I mean, I don't want to sound too philosophical here, but the point is, there is a legitimacy that you didn't have perhaps in 2003 in Iraq, or in 2005 in Lebanon. It's important, I think, to see this. And the Lebanese in 2005, they were very intelligent, understood the importance of the narrative. I think so. I'm not going to go on at length, but 2005, there was a friend of mine who heads a big ad agency, and with his partners, they had really participated in the revolt of 2005 in Lebanon, the so-called Independence Intifada. And they helped it in many ways, symbolically, in terms of its symbolism, in terms of the colors that were held up, the scarves that were worn, the slogans that came out. In a way, they fed into, they created a narrative. And they understood that this narrative was important precisely because there was an outside audience, predominantly a Western audience, looking at it. And what do Western audiences look for? They look for narratives in what's going on. They look for one in Georgia, they look for one in the Ukraine. for a Western audience to understand Lebanon, they're never going to understand the complexity of Lebanon. But they do understand that, well, if you've got, this is a David and Goliath fight. We are with David. I'm not sure many would appreciate that comparison, but anyway, the point of the matter is that the Lebanese protesters played off what they understood, the West, how the West wanted them to be. They understood the West wanted to see a heroic narrative here, and they did it in terms of their protests, in terms of the symbolism of their protests. And so that's one aspect of foreign intervention that I think is interesting to this day. We saw this in Egypt, the symbolism at Tahrir Square, the symbolism in Benghazi, perhaps less successful in Yemen, but an effort to appeal to outside, to the Western media in particular, but to the outside world in general, to say we are part of this story of liberation, no matter how true or false that is. We deserve to be given, we deserve to be recognized for this. And may I just add, before I go to the aftermath, one thing in which Lebanon was quite important, and we may see this in other contexts, is that Hariri, when he was assassinated, the United Nations put together an international investigation of this crime, and that investigation eventually led to a tribunal, which is functioning. I've been critical of it, but I would like to see it succeed, which is functioning, in fact, under a Canadian. The prosecutor is a Canadian. And so what we see here also, this is the first time that the UN investigated a political assassination, first time ever. We see the intervention of the UN, the intervention of international justice to a certain extent. And this is something also that we may see replicated, problematically perhaps, in some of these Arab societies. As you know, some of you may know, the ICC has already indicted Gaddafi and Saif al-Islam. There is the possibility, it's not easy, but there is the possibility of indictments in Syria eventually for crimes against humanity. I mean, the notion of outside intervention, whether direct intervention or through the instruments of the international community and the judicial instruments of the international community, is something today much more acceptable than it was 5-6 years ago. Finally, I'd like to discuss the aftermath, because this has been under I think, many people, one of the reasons Lebanon, I think, also suffers today as a sort of an initial spark for the Arab uprising, is the aftermath. In Lebanon 2005, we had 2005, we had February, March 2005, and that was then followed by parliamentary elections in which all these people who had been united at Martyrs Square suddenly became political rivals. As is usual in Lebanon, it broke down into political acrimony. In 2006, there was the war, the Hezbollah-Israel war in South Lebanon. South Lebanon, most of Lebanon, focused in South Lebanon. So there was a perception by 2006, and that was, by the way, followed by more domestic conflict, leading almost to the verge of, I won't say civil war, but leading to, essentially, almost armed conflict that was averted. So that, this tended to shape the perceptions of 2005. If you have a disappointing aftermath, then you tend to look at the revolt itself, the rebellion itself, the intifada itself, as being perhaps a failure. And certainly in the case of Lebanon, this was the perception. I think it's a mistake to go to in a way, to interpret things quite with with such, how should I say, absolutism. Because in a way, if you judge these revolts by their aftermath, then in a way it's almost an indirect way of saying, well, if the outcome doesn't satisfy what we see as a satisfactory outcome, then it delegitimizes the initial decision to rebel. I don't think anyone today can challenge the legitimacy, for example, of the Syrian people to want to overthrow the Assad regime, or of the Libyan people to want to overthrow the Gaddafi regime, or the Egyptians to get rid of Hosni Mubarak. In other words, it's difficult, I think, to play to this game of 20/20 hindsight, nor is it particularly realistic. Let me add to that. I mean, excuse me. Obviously, one thing that is interpreting the outcomes today in many Arab countries, we saw this in Tunisia, we're seeing this in Egypt today. One salient, or one essential question is, will the Islamists come out on top? Now, the perception, rightly or wrongly, we can discuss this in another context, is that if the Islamists emerge, by and large, religious groups are undemocratic. Therefore, they will create orders that are undemocratic, where women will be discriminated against, where people will not be able. These are illiberal orders that are going to emerge. This is an essential problem today at the center of the interpretation of the Arab revolts. Now, it's a shame, I think, today that we should be, if we adopt this attitude, that essentially we're falling into the paradigm that Arab dictators themselves have created for us for so long. Because it really was the Arab dictators who said, look, it's either us or them, either us or the Islamists. There is perhaps at some point, you have to break out of that. Take what happened in Tunisia. You had an election in Tunisia in which 35 and 40% went to Ennahda. Fine, that was, personally, I'm not religious, so I don't like to see religious groups coming out on top. But the point is, you still have 60% of Tunisian society that is not vote Ennahda. In Egypt, we'll see what the outcome is when these elections finally end. I've never seen longer elections. I think that the counterweights in many of these societies, in Syria as well, that the counterweights to the religious parties are often substantial. We shouldn't assume automatically that if the Islamists do well, therefore the initial revolt, the initial decision to rebel was necessarily wrong. And yet, I think there is a lot of interpretation today that is using precisely this approach.